Welcome to Silent Screams, where we dive into the terrifying world of real horror stories that will keep you up at night. If you're ready to hear stories that chill the bones and question the very nature of reality, then you've come to the right place. These stories aren't just for the faint of heart. They are accounts of things that can't be explained, things that go beyond the realm of the ordinary, things that will make you question whether you're truly alone. Tonight, I'm going to take you on a journey through some of the most disturbing and eerie experiences people have encountered, experiences that will leave you wondering if the darkness around you is something more than just a lack of light. So, turn down the lights, sit back, and prepare yourself for these spine-chilling stories. The first story comes from a man named David, a quiet, unassuming guy who had always believed that the supernatural was nothing but superstition. David had lived in his small, one-bedroom apartment for over a year without ever thinking twice about the building's history. It was an old structure, dark, narrow hallways, peeling wallpaper, and the creaking of wooden floors underfoot. Nothing special, nothing out of the ordinary. That is, until the night he came home to a broken door. David had just finished his shift at a local diner and was tired, ready to crawl into bed and forget about the world for a few hours. But when he reached his apartment, something was off. The door was slightly ajar. At first, he thought maybe he had forgotten to lock it, but when he stepped inside, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The air felt heavy, thick with an unnatural stillness. The apartment was pitch black, the only light coming from the dim glow of streetlights outside. But then, as David stepped further into the room, something strange happened. The hallway light flickered on, slowly at first, like it was struggling to stay alive, before fully illuminating the space. But there was no sound of a switch being flipped. David's heart began to race as he slowly made his way into the kitchen. That's when he noticed the first odd thing. His kitchen cabinets were open, wide open, as though someone had rummaged through them. David wasn't a messy person, and he always kept his kitchen organized, but now things were scattered on the counter: cans of soup, a jar of peanut butter, an empty cereal box. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. The real horror was in the silence. It was almost as if the apartment itself was holding its breath, waiting. David closed the cabinets with trembling hands and quickly checked the rest of the apartment. Everything seemed undisturbed until he reached the living room. That's when he saw it. A figure just standing there, staring at him. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe he was just too tired. But as he blinked and rubbed his eyes, the figure remained. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned, long black dress, her face obscured by dark, matted hair. She stood completely still, her back slightly hunched as if she was trying to remain unnoticed, but there was something terrifyingly wrong about her presence. David froze. His body refused to move, as if some unseen force was holding him in place. Then, she turned her head. Slowly. Almost unnaturally. David's breath caught in his throat. The woman's eyes were wide open, pitch black, like two owl voids. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him, as though the very air around him had turned to ice. Before he could react, the figure stepped forward, dragging one foot across the floor with an eerie scraping sound that echoed through the room. David stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. His instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead, unable to move. He felt trapped in a suffocating silence that seemed to press him from all sides. The woman reached out toward him, her fingers long and bony, her grip ice cold. When they made contact with his wrist, her mouth opened, but no words came out, only a soft, guttural hiss that seemed to vibrate through his bones. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished into thin air. David was left standing there, trembling in the dark, his mind reeling with what he had just witnessed. He was alone, no one else had seen it, no one else would believe him. He had no choice but to lock every door and window, staying awake the entire night, too terrified to even blink, wondering if she would return. The next day, David decided to investigate the apartment building's history. What he found would only deepen the mystery. The building, as it turned out, had once been a boarding house in the early 1900s. Several residents had reported strange occurrences, but nothing as intense as what David had experienced. However, one story stood out about a woman who had died there under mysterious circumstances, a woman who was said to haunt the halls of the building. David's curiosity got the best of him, and he decided to return to his apartment that night, determined to confront whatever was haunting him. This time, he was armed with a camera, hoping to capture something, anything, that might explain the eerie presence he had encountered. As night fell, David entered his apartment, his heart pounding in his chest. The building was silent, too silent, as though it was holding its breath. He set up the camera in the living room and sat in the corner, waiting. Hours passed. The only sound was the occasional creak of the floorboards, the wind howling outside. He was beginning to think it had all been a figment of his imagination. But then, it happened again. The lights flickered on, just like the night before. And there she was, the woman in the black dress, standing in the exact same spot. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, a shadow moved, a tall, dark figure, too large to be human. David's heart stopped. He couldn't breathe. The figure seemed to loom over her, towering, its shape vaguely human but distorted, as if it were made of the very darkness itself. David's hands shook as he reached for the camera, but his fingers wouldn't cooperate. The coldness in the room grew unbearable, and then, the woman turned to face him. Her mouth opened wide, far too wide, as if it were stretching beyond its natural limit. Her teeth were jagged, sharp, like a predator's. And then, in a voice that was not her own, a low, rumbling whisper filled the room. "Leave, or you will never escape." David was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to scream. The air around him grew thick, oppressive, as if the very walls of the apartment were closing in on him. The dark figure behind the woman seemed to grow, its presence expanding, suffocating the room. And then, without warning, everything went black. When David woke up, he was lying on the floor in the same spot, the camera beside him, still recording. But the footage was corrupted, nothing but static. The apartment was eerily quiet, the air still. And when he looked around, the woman and the shadow were gone. David didn't stay another night in that apartment. He packed up his things and left, never to return. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman in the black dress was still watching him, waiting for him to come back. And the darkness, it seemed to follow him wherever he went. To this day, no one knows what really happened in that apartment, but David's story is one that many people in the building still talk about in hushed tones. Some say it's just a story, a figment of his imagination. But others, the ones who felt the presence of something unnatural, know better. Something in that building was waiting, and it wasn't finished with David yet. As David stumbled out of the apartment building, his mind raced. His body felt heavy, as though the very air around him had grown dense with an unshakable weight. He had tried to convince himself it was all a bad dream, that perhaps the fear had made him see things that weren't really there, but the images of the woman in the black dress, her face twisted with that unnatural, gaping mouth, haunted him every second. His hands trembled, and his breath came in shallow gasps as he walked down the dimly lit street, away from the building that had been his home for over a year. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly. Every shadow, every flicker of light, made his heart race. He hadn't told anyone what had happened, not yet. He was too afraid that no one would believe him, or worse, that he'd be branded as insane. But the terror he had felt in that apartment, that cold, suffocating dread, was something that words could never fully capture. David had never been a man of superstition. He had always dismissed ghost stories as mere folklore, something people told to entertain themselves or scare their children. But now he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. And it wasn't just the woman, no, there was something else, something darker, something that lingered in the air around him. It had been hours since he left the apartment, but his mind was still there, trapped within the confines of those haunted walls. He couldn't forget the way the air had thickened when the woman's figure had appeared, or the way the shadow behind her had seemed to ripple, almost like it was made of pure darkness. It had been as if something was watching him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And that moment hadn't passed. He needed to get out of the city. He needed to get away from all of it. David decided to take a break from everything. He drove for hours, heading into the woods, far away from the chaos and fear that gripped him. The solitude of nature seemed like the perfect place to clear his mind. He had no plan, no destination in mind. He just wanted to escape the suffocating grip of terror that had been following him since that night. But the woods, as it turned out, had their own secrets. The first few hours were peaceful, almost serene. The forest around him was quiet, save for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of leaves in the wind. David parked his car near a small, abandoned cabin he had stumbled upon during his drive. The place looked like it hadn't been used in years, its wooden frame weathered by time and neglect. But something about it seemed inviting. Maybe it was the promise of peace, the chance to sleep without fear, or perhaps it was just the desperate need to be alone. David spent the next few hours exploring the cabin, finding nothing but old furniture covered in dust, cobwebs hanging from the rafters. But then, as he ventured deeper into the building, something caught his eye, something on the floor, half hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers. It was a photograph. David picked it up, dusting it off. The image was old, faded with time, but still recognizable. It showed a woman standing in front of what appeared to be a church. Her face was obscured by shadows, her features barely visible. But there was something unsettling about the image, something that made his skin crawl. The woman's eyes, they were black, hollow, just like the eyes of the figure in his apartment. David felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He turned the photo over, hoping to find some sort of clue, but there was nothing written on the back. It was just a simple, blank space. His hands trembled as he looked at the photo again, his mind racing. He had to know more. Was this the same woman? Had she once lived in this cabin? Had she died here? Suddenly, the wind outside howled, sending a shudder through the cabin. David glanced at the window, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw a shadow pass by the glass. But when he turned to look, there was nothing there. The air felt thicker now, charged with something he couldn't quite explain. The darkness was closing in around him, and for the first time in a long while, David felt truly afraid. That night, as he lay in the creaky bed of the cabin, David couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling. The photograph, which he had placed on the nightstand, now lay face down, as though someone had moved it. David's mind raced. Was he imagining things? Was he going insane? Or was something truly watching him? He rolled over to face the wall, trying to shut out the creeping paranoia. But then, he heard it, a faint scratching sound, like nails against wood. At first, he thought it was the wind, or perhaps an animal outside, but the sound grew louder, more insistent, until it was right next to his bed. David's heart hammered in his chest as he slowly turned his head to look toward the source of the noise. There, standing in the doorway, was the same woman, the one from his apartment. Her eyes were wide and empty, her mouth hanging open in that grotesque, twisted smile. Her figure was half transparent, like she was flickering in and out of existence, but her presence was undeniable. She was there, and she was watching him. David's breath caught in his throat. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His body was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer terror that gripped him. The woman took a step forward, her feet making no sound as they glided across the floor. Then, the shadow behind her shifted. The dark figure, the thing that had followed him from the apartment, loomed in the corner of the room, its form shifting and undulating like smoke. David couldn't tell if it was a man, a creature, or something far worse, but he could feel its presence. It was like it was sucking the life out of the room, consuming everything in its path. The woman reached out her hand, her fingers elongated and unnaturally thin. As she did, the shadow moved, stretching and twisting toward him, its long, tendril-like fingers wrapping around the edges of the room. David gasped for air, but the atmosphere around him was thick, suffocating. The walls felt as though they were closing in, pressing him further and further into the bed. The woman's smile widened, her mouth stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows upon rows of jagged teeth, sharp as knives. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, everything went silent. The woman, the shadow, the oppressive weight in the air, they were all gone. David lay there, trembling, drenched in cold sweat, trying to understand what had just happened. Had he dreamed it? Was it all in his head? Or was it real? His heart was still racing, his body trembling with fear. He couldn't stay in this cabin. He couldn't stay in this place any longer. The terror was too much. He grabbed his things in a panic and fled into the night, running through the dense woods, not looking back. The moon hung high above him, casting long shadows between the trees. The wind howled, and for a moment, David could swear he heard something, or someone, following him. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift, as though the forest itself was alive, shifting and changing in response to his fear. David ran until he could run no longer, until his legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto the cold earth. His mind was spinning, his vision blurry. He could hear the sound of breathing, raspy, labored, like something was standing over him. He forced himself to look up, expecting to see the woman, but instead, there was nothing. Just the trees. Just the silence. For a moment, David thought he might have escaped, that he had outrun whatever it was that was hunting him. But deep down, he knew better. Whatever had been following him, whatever had haunted him in that apartment, whatever had reached out to him. In the woods, it wasn't done with him yet. And he couldn't shake the feeling that it was only just beginning.